Wow, good evening. There are a lot of you out there. Thank you so much for coming, and thank you to my colleagues and my friends, and particularly all the students for showing up tonight. I know it's chilly. I'm going to talk for a little while, and then we're going to open it up to conversations and questions. First, I want to say Chag Sukkot. Thank you for coming to the Sukkah. And it's a beautiful thing to have this invitation to be able to speak with you about themes of Jewish identity, community, and engaging in justice. We have come as a Jewish people from a compelling history, and we have worked hard. We have enjoyed tremendous success as Jews, and we see ourselves as a people of justice. But still, while there has been a history of partnership, right now we are not in strong relationship with communities of color, both inside of the Jewish community and outside of the Jewish community. Can we turn it up? So right now we are not in strong relationship with communities of color, both inside of the Jewish community and outside of the Jewish community. And many U.S. Jews are broken by what's happening in Israel with Palestinians. And despite our accomplishments as Jews, we are targeted. There are people in this nation who want to ensure that we will not replace them. This is a complex, confusing, curious, compelling time to be Jewish in the United States. And to see our next generation through, I'd like to suggest that we need to be better grounded in who we are as Jews. We need to understand ourselves as part of a diverse U.S. citizenry and be informed by our propensity to mobilize, engage, and act. And it's not just thriving Jews and the Jewish community that's at stake. I think it's fair to say that if we look through the lenses of systematic injustice, statistics tell us some of our lives are at stake, that we don't matter, and that we need to do something about this. As United States Jews, we have a historical narrative that threads our story through Columbus discovering the Americas. The first documented case of a Jew coming to the United States shores, or the shores of America, was a man named Chaim Gans, who was part of Sir Walter Raleigh's expedition to arrive in North Carolina. He came here in 1585. Next came the settling of German Jews, who left Germany because of persecution, restrictive laws, and economic hardship. They began arriving to the United States in the 1840s. And then came Eastern European Jews, who were forced out of Europe by overpopulation, legislation designed to oppress, and poverty, and came to the United States enticed by the prospect of some financial and social advancement. Eastern European Jews, including my grandmother Dora and my grandfather Isidore, after whom I am named, began to immigrate to the United States in large numbers around the 1880s. And we as Jews love this part of our story, the part that tells us that we are like other marginalized people here in the United States. The part that tells us that we have been pushed out and we have been poor and restricted from employment and housing opportunities, and that our access to upward mobility has been limited. And this part of our history is not untrue. And we love this part of our history and this container in which this narrative exists. The book jacket of our story, if you will, is covered, let's say, with sepia-tone photos of a German man in a fine suit and a hat next to his wife in a high-collar dress. Next to that photo might be a black and white photo of a girl, maybe 11, working in a garment factory adjacent to a picture of a bearded, black-clad pushcart operator making his way down Orchard Street. There's probably a picture of a beautiful, towering 1880s synagogue that looks more like an Episcopal church than a shtetl shul. There's a picture of two young, brave IDF soldiers on our book jacket. Neither is older than 21, and one is likely a woman. And then there might be a picture of a rabbi on the front of this book. And he's probably in a billowy white robe. The photo might be in color, and his entire congregation is all white. But that is not our whole story. 20% of Jews in the United States are racially and ethnically diverse. Most non-Orthodox Jews will marry folks who are not Jewish. And because we have the privilege of living in the United States, the community of folks from whom we will pick our partners and spouses is and will be increasingly people of color. So what does it mean as a community that we perpetuate an inauthentic narrative about who we are and who we will be? What does it mean that we have a big, diverse Jewish community right out there, right in here, and folks who, for whatever reason, don't care to dive in within four walls or donate to Jewish communal organizations, folks who might be queer or differently abled, or who are torn in their souls about what's going on in Israel, or who are black, like me, people who challenge the narrative. These are folks with whom we in the Jewish community are struggling to open our hearts to, bring home, and make feel welcome. And what do our struggles with racism and inclusion, coupled with the fact that we are also engaged, committed, outraged, sometimes scared, a courageous community, what does it mean that we need to learn about and know about to be our best selves, to be more expansive, more inclusive? And how do we navigate as we try to authentically and purposefully engage in justice? And why does it even matter? It matters because this is about people. It's about us and really our most basic needs. We want to feel seen and known. We want to have a strong sense of our identities, and we want to be integrated and whole. We want to and need to feel connected to something bigger, like a community in which we matter. We need to know that we belong to someone and something and somebody, that we are part of a community. And while right now feeling successful as a person of purpose can be a challenge, we need to and want to feel like we can make a difference, like we can make a positive contribution, and we can contribute things to make it better than it is right now. Like we are firmly situated and pointed in the right direction on the arc that bends toward justice. Well, I grew up just down the street in the Western Addition, before really there were any white people. And I was bat mitzvahed at one of San Francisco's oldest synagogues, went to Israel with the regular group of kids who went with all of the synagogues, and I find myself in this amazing role working deep inside of the Jewish community. It's taken me some time to feel like part of the mainstream organized Jewish world. My story isn't really reflected in our community narrative, and there's always something that reminds me that no matter how good I look on paper or how strong my Jewish bona fides are, darn it if confusion about who we are as a community, our racism, and our struggle with really engaging in justice doesn't get in the way. A couple of years ago, I started to feel more confident as a communal Jew, and I started to dip my toe into engagement. An email came across my desk asking for folks to deliver Rosh Hashanah grocery bags to those homebound. I loved the idea. There was something practical and essential for me to do. Last year, I took with me my daughter, who was almost 11 at the time. I anticipated it might be confusing for folks on the other side of each grocery bag to have two black people standing in front of them wishing them a Shana Tova. But to be totally honest with you, I also figured us being black would play into their assumptions about well-trained labor who deliver food. And so maybe it wouldn't be that weird, especially if it never occurred to them that we actually were Jewish. So this year I was excited again to sign up for my Rosh Hashanah grocery bag delivery run, and this time I reached out to a white Jewish friend to join me. Before hitting my route, which reminded me of delivering papers when I was 8 years old, I ran home to tidy up, mostly to put on a proper shirt to hide my tattoos. While I've grown comfortable wearing them out at work, I've made it a personal policy to keep my tattoos hidden from Jewish elders, worried I might offend them or trigger Holocaust memories. All cleaned up and outside of a huge Berkeley apartment complex, I rang the doorbell, introduced myself saying, "I am Ilana Kaufman, here on behalf of Jewish Family Community Services delivering Rosh Hashanah groceries." I was quickly invited into each building and given directions to each door. But when my friend and I arrived to each apartment and a face from inside emerged to greet me, I was suddenly invisible. All attention directed to my white friend. I was immediately not Ilana Kaufman. She was. On my delivery route was a man whose name I did not immediately recognize and whom I had never met in person. When we went to deliver his groceries, power wheelchair bound, he asked us to come in and put his things away. Put the perishables in the fridge, we happily complied. Put the candles in the upper shelf of the cabinet, no problem. But then he conversed only with my friend, asking her name, even for the spelling of her last name, about her work. But there I was, the initiator of this activity, the one who made all the plans, who changed her shirt and rang the bell, and he straight up ignored me. And this happened over and over again that day. And I'll be honest, after it was all over and I dropped my friend to her car, I drove away and felt stupid. Like an idiot that I hadn't anticipated what would happen when I brought a white person with me. And I felt sad and hurt that I was invisible. He absolutely could not see me. There was nothing in how he saw the world, specifically the Jewish world, that suggested Ilana Kaufman could be me. And even though I was standing right in front of him, in his mind's eye, the ayin tachat ayin of the man in the motorized chair, he couldn't see me. The story of our lives as Jews is bound in the book cover depicting German Jews and factory workers and push carts and shuls that look like churches. In motorized chairman's version of our Sefer Chaim, our book of life, there are no pages with people who look like me. Stories like this illustrate how confusing and counterproductive it is for us in the organized Jewish world to be educated about our history when it obfuscates from or makes opaque our truth about who we are, who is part of our tribe. This not whole story thing, this half-truthing that we do, what is the delicate way to say, when we don't tell the truth, it makes it difficult, if not impossible, to 1, see people for who they are and how they want to be seen, 2, to meaningfully participate and build diverse communities, and 3, authentically act from a place of advancing real justice. We must see people for who they are. And the way to do that means that we need the ability to reflexively consider Dalifne mi ata omed, know before whom you stand. And while sure, as Jews we most often see this phrase in synagogues above the ark as a gentle admonition to enter synagogue prayer in a way that reminds you to be respectful before God, I would suggest that since there is no evidence in Jewish text that we have any idea what God looks like, and we carry a core belief that all people are made in the divine image, I would suggest knowing before whom you stand is really a reminder that any one of us in our form that may be unfamiliar or even unknown to you is divine, and we could be God. People are precious, and we don't know their stories, and we don't know who they really are, and thus we must treat each individual as if it could be God herself, with care, thoughtfulness, mindfulness, and love. And this is especially important for us as U.S. Jews, as we have a racially and ethnically diverse population who is only becoming more hued. We are part of a U.S. citizenry who has a single charge, which is to be civically informed, connected, engaged. And that means we are responsible for all of our neighbors, our classmates, and our friends. We don't know their experiences, nor their burdens, but we do know the darker their skin in this country, the less they will be seen in the Jewish world, and the more they will be seen in the dangerous secular world. Our charge as U.S. Jews is steeped in our own history and experiences. We arrived to this country pushed and pulled and sometimes hunted. While European in background, we felt different from those other kinds of white people. We knew ourselves to be hardworking, smart, resilient, and we understood ourselves to be values-driven engagers who recognize injustice at every turn. We saw ourselves as more like those being marginalized than the marginalizers. We felt an internal motivation and a spiritual propulsion to march for civil rights. But something happened along the way from the 1940s, 50s, the 1960s to the 2000s. The United States codified into its systems of housing and economic advancement Jews from Europe, shattering the myth that Jews pull themselves up by their bootstraps. And Jews and other white ethnics, our upward mobility was the result of programs that allowed Jews to float on a rising tide of economic success. And the ripples are that it moved the European Jewish community closer to whiteness. And here we are in 2017, in a nation so broken by racism that we are engaged in some sort of cold civil war, a nation where 20% of my Jewish community wakes up every day first wondering if our black and brown children will be okay, and then wondering if we will make it emotionally, if not physically, alive to work today. We have no idea before whom we stand. And therefore, we as US Jews must look beyond and commit ourselves to a broader conception of community, including the Jewish community. We need to broaden what's in our mind's eye. We as Jews are a people of diaspora, and people of motion and movement. And we are a people who know how to stand on the edge, to see things from different vantage points, to take in and consider another's perspective and their experience. And we are especially capable of this because we see beyond ourselves. We move from location to location. We are designed to shift shape, to adapt and to become anew, even sometimes to the point where we are not immediately recognizable to ourselves. And to ensure that we never lose connection, we have been given the capacity for moral imagination. Edmund Burke's notion that our ethics should transcend our own personal experience and embrace the dignity of the human race. And as Jews in the United States become more racially diverse, moral imagination is one tool to ensure that we can stand in others' shoes so that we create space for the possibility that we are, in fact, the same in many ways. And as US Jews, just 2.2% of the adult population in this country, we must focus on bringing in, embracing, building and perpetuating our communities. And for us as Jews, we seem fixated on this idea of centralizing a particular Jewish identity, which often excludes most forms of diversity, in the name of perpetuating Jewish community. But what if we shifted the physics and centralized Jewish community and all of our diversity in the name of perpetuating Jewish identity? It would drive us out of our buildings into spaces where communities of color, undocumented immigrants, queers, many of whom are Jewish, gather. And then we gather in communities actively focused on justice as they have lives that to those in power don't really matter. We as a Jewish community have to equitably care for our fellow citizens, neighbors, and our friends, even and especially when it's hard and uncomfortable for us to do. As Jews, we see ourselves essential to and an integral part of what Dr. Martin Luther King called a beloved community. Dr. King's global vision in which all people can share in the wealth of the earth. But let me say this. Dr. King understood that to live in a beloved community, a community of care for and with one another, that it takes personal, not passive commitment, an actual decision to engage in change, a sense of internal unrest that we each have that tells us something critical is wrong and we must do something about it because something essential is at stake. It forces us to come to terms with the fact that those with power must redistribute their resources to literally balance the scales of justice. Dr. King said only a refusal to hate or kill can put an end to the chain of violence in a world that leads us toward a community where men can live together without fear. Our goal is to create a beloved community, and this will require qualitative change in our souls as well as quantitative change in our lives. We must act, we must engage as Jews, and for those of us with unearned power and privilege, we must use it for good and redistribute the abundance so that as a minimum standard, each one of us, our neighbors and our friends, can live in dignity. We must embody the core and universal value of justice. Justice, justice, you shall pursue, but how? How do we get there? What are our strategies and approaches? What are the tools? We must be learned in diversity, inclusion, and equity studies. We must become culturally competent. And unfortunately, the reality is it's very likely this will not happen inside the Jewish community. But please go learn about the actual frameworks, ideas, and concepts that we need to be able to meaningfully and purposefully engage with people who are different than us. Embrace intersectionality, the idea that our experiences and realities as multidimensionally diverse people matter. We get to be whole, integrated, diverse individuals. Do not make us choose which identity is most important. Those of us with multiple backgrounds don't rank our identities. We just exist as whole people. And don't take that from us, from me. That would be a fool's errand. And more importantly, Jews of multiple identities, we are the present and most definitely the future. Intersectionality is one of the frameworks needed to bring diverse communities together. And a note about intersectionality. Try to set aside your fear that somehow this will make us less Jewish. Trust that we have the capacity to manage ourselves, and don't get in the way of us being whole and who God made us to be. Know United States history and social science, the history of colonialism, slavery, immigration, civil rights, assimilation, whiteness, white supremacy, black power. And know Jewish history in the United States, including the revisionist version that actually includes Jews of color like me. Know how ideas and realities of whiteness fit into your history. We must simultaneously hold that while some white Jews don't see themselves as white, we choose to live in a context that has assigned Jews of European background whiteness, with all of its power, privileges, and responsibilities. With the real diversity of the Jewish community in your mind's eye, also you need to scan everywhere you go in the Jewish world and notice who's missing and commit to finding a way to bring them in. You need to take risks, model leadership, share your work and stories, and fail forward. This is hard work and it's not easy, and we have to learn from each other and our mistakes. So like when we first started this conversation, I mentioned that I went to deliver Rosh Hashanah grocery bags. I mentioned that I got all cleaned up by putting on a proper shirt, that we went to the apartment buildings, I rang the doorbell, and I introduced myself as Ilana Kaufman on behalf of the Jewish Family Community Services here to deliver grocery bags. And like I mentioned, on my delivery route was a man whose name I did not immediately recognize and whom I'd never met in person. The bag said Markowitz on it. Mr. Markowitz asked that those perishables be put in the fridge, and they were, that the candles be placed on the upper shelf of the cabinet, and they were placed just so. And I stood there mute and worked while Mr. Markowitz spoke to my friend. Again, I was the initiator of this activity, the one who made the plans, and he ignored me until my friend says to Mr. Markowitz, "This is Ilana." Mr. Markowitz spun slowly around in his wheelchair and motored over in my direction. He rolled right up to me and said, "I know an Ilana." Mr. Markowitz's tone became soft, and he went on. He said, "I know an Ilana, and she works in the Jewish community." I softly asked, "JCRC?" And Mr. Markowitz said yes. And my friend then said, "This is Ilana Kaufman." Mr. Markowitz slowly rolled closer to me, and then he stared over thick, thick glasses. He looked right at me and was sincerely apologetic. He then reached out his hand to take mine, and he held my hand and told me all of the ways he valued the half year I spent on his behalf, making calls and writing emails to help him successfully navigate anti-Semitism. Mr. Markowitz went on to say that his life is not like the lives of other people because of his disabilities, and that what I did for him really mattered to his quality of life as a disabled person and as an observant Jew. Next to a white person, Mr. Markowitz could not see me. He could not recognize me as part of his Jewish community. Seems he couldn't fathom the form in which I had arrived. And once he was invited to engage in his moral imagination, he knew not only who I was and what I had done for him, but he knew he had hurt me. Mr. Markowitz was still holding on to my hand, squeezing a little longer and a little tighter to make sure I knew he saw me. And I know he saw me. And now he knows who to imagine on the other side of the phone when he calls the Jewish community. He also knows who is missing from his book of life, and perhaps someday he'll add another page that tells our story. I want to conclude with this. Over the summer, my daughter, Noah, attended Jewish summer day camp. And one day I went to pick her up, and there she was, my beautiful brown ponytailed, almost 12-year-old, talking to a little tiny ponytailed brown girl. I thought it was sweet, and I thought it was cute, and I was excited that my Noah could be a mirror for a younger brown Jewish girl. As my Noah and I walked to our car, I heard her say, "Bye-bye, Noah." And from my vantage point, the only person I could see was a grown African-American man, who I assumed was a parent named Noah. And then from behind a car emerged the tiny ponytailed brown girl. And my daughter says to me, "That's Noah." And all I could do was smile, and my heart burst a little bit. Inside the Jewish community, I have spent my entire life looking for a reflection of myself, and there are none. And while I'm fairly certain the Jewish communities that I serve and the Jewish communities in which I exist will never reflect the Jewish community that actually exists, we right here, right now in this Sukkah, are the ones responsible for making all the right changes so that next generation will never question if they are in our book of life. We have to print the next revision so our community here now is within, and that they will always be able to see reflections and stories of themselves. That they know that they are included, they are cared for, and that they matter to their community. I understand that I am supposed to be a bridge. I am of the mulatto millennium. I am what author Denzi Sena calls the new people. I know I am supposed to hold space between the divide until the rest of us get there. Our Jewish community story isn't one of you or me or them. It is one of us. And I need you, and we need you to make intentional, brave, strategic choices oriented toward making change, creating the beloved community about which Dr. King is talking. Because this is about all of us, and it is up to us to fight for justice inside and outside of the Jewish community, for all of our communities, as they are overlapping and often the same. Seeing people for who they are and how they want to be seen, honoring that we are precious and possibly divine, and committing to an intentional and action-oriented way to engage in and activate are some of the tools that we need to not only make our community more inclusive, expansive, and welcoming, but these tools are what will build and fortify this pathway forward and ensure that we together are walking forward and focused and pointed directly and we are focused and pointed in the right direction on the arc that bends toward justice. Thank you.
We'll have some time now to ask Ilana some questions and just try to speak up, maybe even repeat the question.
Yeah. Questions, curiosities, comments, opinions. Back there. Will you be loud and then I'll try to repeat your question? Wait, I can't hear you. Come again?
Yeah, so as a woman of color in front of your, especially with I just wonder, how do you navigate anti-Semitism on the African American community and then anti-blackness situation? And then on top, because I was reading something about James Baldwin, he mentioned something about the land of glory, tense relationship that emerged between Jewish and black people, because oftentimes Jews were Yeah, like because oh, we're the true Jews. These other Jews aren't.
Right.
So how do you just what do you think about that? How you navigate?
Okay. Okay. The two questions were, one was about, as a black woman and as a Jewish person, how do I navigate anti-Semitism in the black community and anti-black racism in the Jewish community? That was the first question. And the second question was sort of discussing, he had read a piece of Baldwin, and about in the 1960s when Jews were some of the only folks who would rent housing to African Americans because of the racist housing laws. And on the one hand, it was perceived as it was nice that the Jews reached out to the black community to support housing opportunities, but on the other hand, there was a dynamic where it was of conflict because the perception was that Jewish people abused that relationship. Is that right?
Yeah. Not only James Baldwin, but
Okay. 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 So in terms of the first question, I mean, about navigating anti-black racism in the Jewish community, anti-Semitism in the black community. I mean, I'll be really honest. I grew up in the western edition of San Francisco, and it really was full of only African Americans, Japanese, people from internment camps, and there were like a couple radical communist Jews. And I never experienced anti-Semitism in the black community. I never experienced anti-Semitism home in Texas, where my father's family is from. And so, in some ways, my experience with anti-Semitism in the black community has not been particularly profound. As an individual navigating African American communities in different parts of my African American world. Having said that, I'm well steeped in the history of like the Nation of Islam, for example, which is absolutely anti-Semitic and anti-Zionist. And I also know that the nation doesn't represent all Muslims, all black Muslims, for example. And so, we'll flip to the other side. I mean, I'll be honest, I grew up in a community where the term I heard was Schwarze, which means nigger in Yiddish. And I didn't learn that from anybody but my own community. And so, I was exposed to more anti-black racism intimately as an individual growing up in the Jewish community. I was not really exposed to anti-Semitism in the black community. When I pull back 10,000 feet though, I think there's a lot of evidence of some African Americans in leadership roles being particularly anti-Semitic and using a series of stereotypes to characterize and caricaturize Jews and Jewish Americans in a way that's designed to not only keep Jews down, but to separate Jews from other communities who've been marginalized. And so I really question when any community leverages a Jewish community or any other community to elevate themselves at our expense. And then I'll just, again, on the 10,000 feet, in the Jewish world, I think there are a lot of ways anti-black racism expresses. And from my perspective, the most troublesome is not the calling of the names or the perpetuating of individual stereotypes. It's when, as a whole community, especially because there are people like me inside the Jewish community, when we don't support movements like the Black Lives Matter movement, I experience that as racist. Because how is it possible that my black Jewish life doesn't matter to my community? How can that possibly be? And there's, I work with 27 synagogues in the East Bay, and there's only one that has a Black Lives Matter sign outside. And that Black Lives Matter sign, every time I walk in that door, it feels like a salve. It's like a warm bath, because I know I'm safe. I don't know I'm safe in any other synagogue because I don't know that I matter. And so, the way I experience anti-black racism or anti-Semitism is different for each community. Both come up all of the time in different ways. And again, I think for us, the bigger charge is whenever somebody's using anti-Semitism or anti-Zionism or anti-black racism or homophobia or transphobia or whatever the issue is, they're doing it to separate us. And they're doing it to drive a wedge between us because it makes it so that we can't focus on the bigger issues. And so, you know, I see it, and then my obligation is to question it and wonder what that motive is, because my higher charge and my higher purpose is to be in connection and in community, not in conflict. And it's designed to put us in conflict. And there's a lot to talk about in terms of what happened with black people and Jewish people in the 1960s. I'm going to hip you to a book later that will cover all of that for you. But I will say one thing, which is this. James Baldwin was an amazing observer of social dynamics. And in the 1960s, and this is going to touch upon your question, in the 1960s, James Baldwin wrote about the Jewish community sort of being in relationship with the African American community, and he worried that the Jews would become too comfortable in this kind of relationship of helping African Americans out. And he thought that, and the caution was not for African Americans, it was for Jews. Because he said if Jews don't really understand themselves in relation to the dynamic around class and economics at the time, the dynamic around race and racism at the time, Jews will forget who they are. And we will lose our sense of consciousness that we are marginalized people. And we will become unclear that we are hunted too. And I think in some ways that has proven to be true, you know, in this contemporary moment. So with that. Is there another question or, okay, you're number 1, you're number 2, you're number 3, okay? Don't forget your order. Nice and loud because it's hard to hear.
Okay, so when you come into contact, obviously with like, am I not loud enough?
But I'm just leaning in.
Okay, when you come into contact with like liberal organizations or groups that you have to work with that find like conflict between like one or more of your like identities, like how do you like realistically like deal with that? Like,
Yeah.
how do you explain it to them? How do you sort of compartmentalize it yourself?
That's a great question. So when we're working in social justice spaces,
Your mic went out. I just had to replace the batteries. Thanks.
when we're working in social justice and particularly progressive or left spaces, and somebody challenges So one is that there's plenty of work to do. Okay, there's no paucity of work for us to do out there. And I think that, you know, I want to encourage you to take a long view and to work in spaces where you can feel safe right now and affirmed and validated for who you are, and like you can really ground in your power and rock whatever kind of justice out that you want to try to rock out, okay? And it doesn't mean that you're afraid of working in other spaces. It doesn't mean that you don't have the chops for it. It means that this is a time where we need to sort of really think clearly about what our talents are, our tools are, what we can offer, where we can do it in a way that is in most authentic alignment, and where we can do that in a way that we can do our best work. That's not in a space that's going to challenge who you are while you're trying to do something positive, okay? So the first thing that we do is make good choices. And there's nothing uncourageous about that. It's entirely strategic. When we do that, it puts us in community with people who are like us. And then we work with the community to enter other community spaces together. Part of that also is figuring out who your bridge people are. It may not be you who should be working in that very different other progressive space. It might be one of your friends, your colleagues, your allies. And then when that relationship is warmed, they can bring you in. So the other side of that is, but what happens once you're in there and something happens and they come at you for who you are? There's no hypocrisy in defending yourself when you're engaging in justice and doing good work. So the first thing you have to do is to be aware that you get to stand up and fight back, internally, spiritually, however you want to express yourself, but you get to defend yourself when people come at you in a way that's not okay. Be careful how you do that. It may not be that same day, right? So the other thing is, like, when somebody attacks your identity in a space where you're trying to do good work, that opportunity is going to present itself again. And so the way to think about it is this my moment to respond? Am I safe? Do I have allies here who are going to have my back if it just gets funky? And if you don't have the safety tools that you need, maybe today is not your day. Maybe you go back into that space to do work again, but you go back with a friend. You go back in a way that you've built a relationship with somebody so you can actually communicate about what happens when it feels funky. And eventually you want to get to a place where you feel so whole, so confident in your skills and who you are, so strong in the choices you're making about where you're doing your work, that when somebody challenges a part of your identity, you feel grounded in your response, you feel confident in speaking up and advocating for yourself, and that you know you have people there behind you to stand up for you. So, right on. Okay, the gentleman behind you. It's really hard to hear. Oh, you're so sweet, thank you. Thank you. Hi.
So, have you ever had a chance to observe how other religions interact with people who share their beliefs, who are minorities? Because I understand that in this speech you were a little critical about how some aspects of the Jewish community not accommodating or open about minorities within their believers. But I'm asking about whether you had a chance to observe how other religions tackle the same problem.
Good question. So the question was, have I had a chance to observe how other faith groups and religions grapple with the diversity of their communities? I've spent some time with the Muslim community, the African American Muslim community, the Sunni Muslim community, and the Shia Muslim communities. I have not spent time with them all together in the same room. And so, you know, I was just talking with a Muslim colleague about this yesterday. There are, at least in my experience working with the Muslim communities and also some of the Christian communities, there are a lot of divisions and differences. And those divisions come up in terms of where you're from geographically, how you identify ethnically, your level of observance in those religious contexts, among other things. There's also racial and ethnic differences across different faith groups. And so there are some faith groups who are doing similar efforts to be more inclusive, to come across lines of, especially around ethnic boundaries and boundaries related to religious expression. And in some communities, there are no bridges and there are no boundaries. And so, you know, we know there are lots of examples of conflict within different parts of the Muslim community, for example. And there are also, you know, across denominations, even among, you know, in the Jewish community, there are other parts of worlds that identify as different kinds of Jews that also don't feel included because of their denomination, for example. And so the Jewish community has some issues around this. I understand from my colleagues that the Muslim communities have some of these same issues. And certainly, you know, we know that wars have been fought in the Christian communities around some of these issues. So yeah. Other questions or curiosities? I know it's chilly. Yes, Rabbi Lee.
Ilana, first of all, thank you. But I think we'd be remiss not to mention the context of your talk. And you do work for the Jewish establishment. I mean, that
No,
is a
please.
fact. But is to acknowledge the work of Professor Aaron Hahn Tapper and his book.
Yes.
Because as you frame the metaphor of the book, that is a book that should be used in every synagogue in America. It should be promoted by federations and GCRCs. And I just want to say that it's a wonderful place to be in. That Aaron, you've set, and that you've written that book in a way that you're talking about the heart. And I just hope to live to see that book out around the country.
And Rabbi Lee, I think that's great. Thank you. And it's perfect because there's this juxtaposition of the book jacket metaphor that I'm talking about, and Aaron's book has a totally different book cover that tells a different story. And so Aaron's pieces, Professor Mark Dollinger, I'd be remiss not to acknowledge, and his work. And for the brother who left in the yellow hoodie, he should get Mark's new book. But it's important that we both promote the new texts that talk about who the real, for any community you're part of. It's important that there are texts that reflect who you are, and if they don't, people have to write them, and that could be you. So.
Maybe one last question.
Yes, please.
How do you think someone who doesn't identify as Jewish or a person of color could be a good ally?
Yeah, right on. How does someone who doesn't identify as Jewish or a person of color be a good ally? First of all, it's about that decision to be that person. And so if you go back to Dr. King's piece, like, you have to make a decision to act and engage. And so the first thing to do is to identify that you want to do this work and you have something to offer. And then, to be in conversation with people both like you and different than you, to wonder with them what that partnership can I do, and can we all don't need to do the same work. But having conversations with people who are different than you, identifying what your passions are and where you want to work, your strongest work, identifying what your core competencies are and what you have to offer. Also figuring out, even though you really want to do something because you love it, in terms of your work around justice, it might not be what is most important right now to the communities whom you want to serve. And so kind of coming to terms with the labor burden of the work, which is activism is not always fun. And real activism means that you're going to use your most valuable resource for that kind of activism in its most essential place, which means that sometimes it's not what you want to do, it's not what feels good, but it's what makes the difference. So do some reflection, be in relationship and community, and then find a location where you are going to be value added and you're going to stretch and grow. So, right on.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.